All right, so you may have guessed that right that second. I just muted everyone on this chat. Um, and we're going to begin because we want to honor people's time, even though we're probably all sitting in our respective homes and thinking, I've got lots of time, but we want to be respectful of John's time. So John Hall, many of you are members of the church, so you're already familiar with who John is. John is on your screen there. Wave, John, for everybody to know who you are. You can see John's name. We are, as Peace United Church of Christ, we're glad to take an opportunity to kind of host this conversation that John has coined as God, COVID-19, and our calling. So tonight, the intention is that John will have a conversation and have some dialogue, and then we will take time to break away from that into breakout rooms and have some separate discussion. And then come back together and talk a bit more. So that is the intention of our time with each other tonight. And if you, while we're going along, if you have questions, feel free to either raise your hand on the screen, and I'll try to keep an eye on those. You can also use the chat feature if you would like to send a chat to me, and then I will, direct those questions to John as he's talking, and we'll try to have a good conversation. So I'm going to just ask us to just take a moment to be in prayer before we begin our meeting. So if you'll join me in a time of prayer. Gracious and divine Creator, we ask tonight that you bless our conversations together, that you allow us to ponder new ideas and to embrace new ways of thinking. As we explore and listen to one another, may we sense your divine spirit dwelling within us. We ask all of that this day as we gather in your day. Amen. John, it's you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Damien, for this opportunity. And obviously, this is an absolutely devastating moment in the world, and I felt like it was really important for people to talk about it in as many different situations and venues as possible. If you just joined us, I have a background in the sociology of religion, and especially in interpretive sociology, and interpretive sociology is focused about culture and meanings and action. That is, what kinds of meanings do people give to their actions, and what kind of cultural meanings do we have available for thinking about how we're in the world. So sociologists don't have any special insights, prophetic insights or anything, and don't claim to, but we do think quite a bit about what different ways people construe God and the meaning of God in relation to our existence and in relation to what meanings our existence has. And there are, as we all know, many different paths in religion. There's a path of mysticism where people try to gain direct, some kind of direct experience of the divine, of the infinite power that is the universe. There are ways that people are mediated in their relationship to God through an institutional framework, through a church or some other kind of religious organization. There are ways in which people give meaning to things like holy war, fighting in the name of God, with God's grace as they construe it. So there are very many different ways that people think about God, and those ways that people give meaning to God shape our own actions, our own ways of thinking about the world, and our own ways of thinking about situations. So what I want to talk about and encourage you to talk with each other and with us about are some of those meanings. And obviously, COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic raised the deepest of those kinds of questions for us. There's just no question but that the kinds of events that have transpired in the world in the last 4 months, and especially in the last 2 months, are unprecedented in our own historical experience, in our own life experience for any of us. They are global in their immediate effects. They are dramatic in their immediate effects in terms of an almost instantaneous shutting down of a world economy, something that we have never seen in our lifetime. And I suspect because the globe was not so economically interdependent in past centuries, I don't think anybody has ever seen a phenomenon the likes of which we are living through. So it is, I think, broadly speaking, and I know I'm biased in this direction because I've done a lot of studies of the apocalyptic and apocalyptic social movements that construe the end of the world in one way or another. And that's obviously a central religious motif. It figures very strongly in certain versions of Christianity, but not only Christianity. The inclusion of the book of Revelation in the New Testament was something that was contested, and people like St. Augustine thought it to be a great mistake. But nevertheless, apocalyptic thinking is part and parcel of the religious kind of toolkits and the religious cultures that we have available. And I think that events like the ones we're looking at and experiencing and living through today suggest that there are good reasons for that. We experience a virus that is invisible to the naked eye, that has brought the nation, the United States and other nations virtually to a standstill, the economy to a standstill. It has killed hundreds of thousands of people. It has made many more hundreds of thousands of people ill. There's a tremendous fear and anxiety that has to come with it because of its extreme contagiousness, and because although it doesn't have the same effects for everyone, it has dramatic effects, including death, obviously, for many people. And so it is an immense source of fear and anxiety about our own lives, our loved ones, our families, and so forth. It's also, of course, put all of us in an extremely different situation than our ordinary lives. Suddenly we are at the very least in practicing social distancing. We're often, and most of us, sheltering in place unless we're essential workers. We are sometimes quarantined, as my daughter was, for 12 days. And I don't know how she went through with that. As a 14-year-old, it's kind of hard to imagine someone her age going through something like that, where she could not leave her bedroom and bathroom and be with other people. And of course, a completely unsettling experience. And then already there are the deaths that that we know of people that we know and people whom we don't know. And then finally, there's the economic devastation that we don't even begin to understand. So I think that it's worth us just, and maybe we could just, if people have comments or questions about that, maybe we could take a moment here and just break up into groups and talk about people's experiences and people's relationships to this, what I think is rightly considered an apocalyptic event. Can we do that, Damien? Is that within our technological grasp here?
Yes, we should be able to do that. Let me break us up. Do we want to do 2 rooms,
Okay,
John?
so 2 or 3 rooms, I think, yeah, that would be good. And we're just going to go randomly into rooms, and I think Damien and I can dip in and out of them.
All right.
I shared a little of my own personal experience, and do other people have things they would want to share about how it's kind of hit you personally? Yeah, Bob, just go ahead and speak up. I think you have to be unmuted though. Damien, I think you should just go ahead and unmute everyone, and then people can choose to be muted if they want. We have Joyce, we have Bob and Joyce, I think are ready to talk. And as long as you don't have any loud noises in the background, you can just unmute everyone. And if you don't talk when you're not talking, we're good. Bob? I think you have to unmute people, Damien.
I unmuted them all, so.
All right, then, Bob, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right, how's this?
Good.
Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you? Okay, good. Great. So my experience is, I think unlike most people's, I started cancer radiation treatment just before the sequestering, and I was driving over the Santa Cruz Mountains to Santa Clara. And of course, the first 2 days took between 1.5 hours and 2 hours. Once the sequestration orders were issued, that commute went down to 40 minutes. And I've got to tell you, the tragic death and the devastating economic loss to people who lost their jobs, I would have traded hours of commute time to save those people. And you know, I benefited from the very odd circumstances here, but it was not worth it. There's nothing that anybody experienced that will make it worth what's happened.
Joyce, you have to thank you, Bob.
Yes.
Joyce, yeah.
Okay, for myself personally, it's always been a situation where I was always in a rush and was not comfortable being quiet, still, contemplative, perhaps, just always on the move, trying to problem solve and so forth and so on. And so this shelter in place has really put me in my place in that I am learning to be comfortable, to be still, to be more reflective, perhaps, more introspective, and looking at how I had been approaching life. And now this slowdown, I think, has really given me a pause, which is for the better. Of course, given our age too, it would naturally lead to that slowdown. But I think this shelter in place has forced a pause that probably would not have happened quite yet, or to the same degree. So I'm really grateful for that, and to be able to spend time now with my husband in a way that perhaps we were just not necessarily two ships passing in dark, but almost perhaps sometimes. And so this has been a real good thing for us.
Interesting, really interesting. Some people talk about cabin fever. That's been bandied about, but there's a kind of opening up of the inner life in cabin fever if you can allow it to happen. I think that's Jennifer Cooper sent me an email, said she wouldn't be able to make it tonight because she is sheltering in place on Bureau of Land Management land out near Bishop, California. And the email connection is not good, but the connection to the stars is very good. So And someone else mentioned there's a difference between loneliness and solitude. That some people feel loneliness sheltering in place, and some people turn that into solitude. Other people have thoughts.
Going to say that when you were talking about how we conceptualize God around sort of mysticism or institutions or holy war, that I hadn't thought about that. And for me, I've been noticing that I am conceptualizing God more in a mystical sense in my life in this season than I ever have in other seasons. That I was raised much to think about God in the institutional way of the church. And I think kind of without all the distraction of, I don't want to say civilization because I wouldn't take it that far, but without all that structure, I feel like it's allowing me to think about God and experience God more through, I don't know if it's even mysticism, but nature and in ways that are really, really different for how I have in the past.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's spot on. Other people at the moment? Russ?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Is the sound there?
Yes.
Yeah, for me, because I do art, I will go for long times just being sequestered in my studio. So the lifestyle per se has not changed very much, although I will go for these long periods of being alone for the purpose of then meeting with community. So as I'm working, I'm realizing, where is this stuff going? I guess there's not going to be any art show. There's not going to be any concert, or the things that I do, performing and also creating art. There's no end game. And the thing that held me, that gave me a sense of place in my sequesteredness, was that it was going somewhere for an eventual sharing. Now, maybe not so. And another thing I'll just add about this COVID, the unpredictability of it, to me, is what gives it a biblical proportion. You know, we think of whoever we think of as the wise ones, Noam Chomsky or Stephen Hawkins or all these big people, nobody suggested this. There was no voice from anywhere. This was like a bullet from nowhere. That, and I think that is the unsettling quality that gives it such a magnitude.
I completely agree. Bob, I can see your hand. I can't see everybody's hand. So you have the option, by the way, you should have the option to raise your hand. If you open the participants window on your right, I think it will give you a chance to raise your hand, and Damien can see you. But Bob raised his hand and I could see it physically. So Bob.
Just really quickly. Actually, Bill Gates gave a speech about 5 years ago in conjunction with his health work in Africa, and he pointed out that we are vulnerable to a global pandemic.
Absolutely, and he did a program that Damien pointed me to about 5 months ago that is now on Netflix, where he covers the same ground. But even he, I don't think, even people who said, well, there could be this pandemic, I don't think anyone anticipated it happening with the speed and the severity and the economic aftershocks that this has had. It's literally unimagible. Other thoughts at the moment? Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, for us personally, it's hasn't been a huge change in our life. We're both kind of introverts in our way, and so, sitting at home and doing an awful lot of reading is just fine. Cabrillo College is abandoned. It's become my exercise place. The neighbors here have found ways of getting together at 6 feet of distance and being communal in a way actually more neighborly than we have in the past 3 years. So, you know, that's one level. The other level, though, is the unpredictability of the affect of the coronavirus, but not the prediction. We did know, as Bob mentioned, Bill Gates had brought this up. Yeah, it seems unimaginable that this could happen, but what gets me is the extraordinary stupidity of our leadership that continues to, you know, today we have 1 million cases in this country, which is 1/4 of all of the cases in the world, at least those who are recognized, those who have been identified. This enormous amount of deaths that this could have been managed in a much different way to get rid of the Office on Pandemics in the government, you know, sheer stupidity. And so it's this frustration and kind of almost a sense of powerlessness, not just about the virus itself, but about the leadership around us, the political leadership. This, in the one sense, is a physical thing. It's something that's happening in nature. We have to focus on it. But the political management of things is what's, to me, is one of the huge disasters. It's a shameful episode in our history.
It is, and it's a shameful episode that has brought out some of the worst, not only in our own government, I think, but elsewhere around the world. It has given rise to a certain open the door to a certain kind of authoritarianism in many parts of the world, and it certainly has demonstrated the weakness of our healthcare system here in the United States. That gets me a little bit to the things I want to talk about a little bit before we get to what to make of all this on a more social and religious level. And that is, obviously, there are many different, I mean, one of the things about it is that there are so many different levels to this phenomenon. There's the purely biological level of the nature of viruses and how they operate and how they work. And there's a whole biology. I have in-laws who are MDs and PhDs in biology. And, you know, they have this fascinating debate about the character of the virus and how it spreads and so forth. And then there's the epidemiological issue that comes right after that of how does it spread and how can you avoid it spreading. There's the medical treatment issue of what happens when people actually get this virus, and it's tremendously uneven in how it affects people. And then I think the other thing is that it's like the thing that Bob just mentioned, there's this precarity to it. There is this absolute sort of sense that all that's once was solid has melted into air, that we thought that we lived in a society that whatever else we might have agreed with people or disagreed with people politically, and as Matt said, you know, people do a better job or a worse job, governments do, of dealing with it. But you could complain about those things without thinking that the world had in some sense collapsed. And what's striking now is that we're just barely stumbling along collectively around the globe. And any sense that we had of a relatively stable world, the curtain has been pulled back on that in a way. And so that really leads me to ask what we make of it in relation to our sense of religion and our calling and God. And I don't want to, I mean, there are some conceptions of God, and this is the sociologist in me that gets interested in it, to say, well, God is omniscient and omnipotent, and everything that happens is God's will, and you know, things will work out for the best. It's sort of a Panglossian view of God in a way, that Voltaire's famous novel, that you look at the suffering in the world and it's God's will. And that's very hard, I think, for any of us to believe, and therefore has to bring us to some different conception of God. And I have to say, speaking for myself, I think it's wrong to think of it as God's will, but it is, I think, perhaps not wrong for us to think that something is being revealed to us in some prophetic sense, that nature is giving us a wake-up call, that the world has somehow gone onto a track that is not as it should be. And Matt alluded to that in talking about the governmental response. You wonder about a world in which, I mean, I don't know, I'm sure that perhaps some of you have been on a cruise ship. I've never been on a cruise ship. But it does make me wonder about why we have a society in which cruise ships are cruising around the world, disengorging passengers into small towns and exotic places for 2 or 3 hours and then sucking them back in and going on to the next place. It makes me wonder about things like that. It makes me wonder about why, with all the wealth we have in the world, all the suffering that we have as well, it makes me wonder why it is that the death rate from COVID-19 is so much higher among people who are less affluent and people of color. And we have an answer for that, and that is that many people who are in the essential work jobs that are keeping things running even under duress are less affluent and are people of color. And so I think it's revealing in a way of how our society is organized, our global society and our national society, how they're organized, that even though we kind of know these things as we go along, suddenly it's shocking to see them. It's shocking, as Matt pointed out, to see that we have, by all accounts, the most advanced scientific knowledge of medicine in the world. And yet we have a healthcare system that doesn't provide the most advanced healthcare in the world, the disparity between those two things. So, and maybe other people see other contradictions. So maybe I'll just toss it back to everyone here for further thoughts.
John, I'm just kind of curious, yeah, from your perspective, from a sociological perspective. I mean, do we need to experience this disruption for a certain length of time to make it sort of stick, or is it about the depth of the suffering that makes sociological type, societal changes, or just your thoughts on that?
Okay, no, that's a good question and a fair question. And, I think in what I would call a sociological analysis of the apocalypse, people think, oh, well, the apocalypse, people are predicting the end of the world and it never happens. But what you do have, and my internet connection may be unstable here, so I apologize if it is, but what you do have is the end of the world as we know it. And I don't think there's ever been a clearer event that has been the end of the world as we know it. People say, oh, well, we're going to go back to normal. And no doubt we will go back to some kind of normal. I mean, viruses play out. The 1918 flu played itself out, no matter how devastating it was. And there will be a normal that will be reasserted as a normal, but sociologically, it will not be the same normal. And so I think that's the first point. And then the second point is that even as the apocalypse unfolds, there are struggles among different social actors and powerful actors about gaining a grip on how the future will be reconstituted, what the new normal will be. So you already see large companies taking advantage of the stimulus funds that the government made available. One company, I think it was discovered that they took $20 million or so, and now they've decided that it's been exposed, they're going to give it back. So there's a certain kind, there's greed right in the middle of this devastating event. There are people doing things to take advantage of it. And it goes from the highest corporate level all the way down to email scam artists and email con artists that are taking advantage of it. But it's certainly the case also that, certain kinds of business enterprises are saying they desperately deserve more help than others. The cruise lines are getting a lot of support, and I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't get on boats, but I'm not so sure that cruise lines are really the center of human needs at this point in our history. And on the other side, as I think you're kind of implying, Jody, it brings home the real problems of how our society is organized. It brings home the tremendous inequality in healthcare, the tremendous inequality in life chances of people who are poor versus people who are relatively affluent. And I think many people see this as a moment that we have to, if we can't come to grips with those things now, we probably never will. So it is a moment, and this in a way means that it's a situation that's where the post-apocalyptic world is sort of up for grabs.
John, I think Mary has a question, and also Nancy.
Okay, or comment? Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Jody said. I read that people keep clamoring to go back to normal, and I just want to scream and say, I don't want to go back to what we had. I want something new and different. I want people to acknowledge that we have people on the front lines who have no health insurance in this country. We have cruise lines that contribute nothing, and we subsidize them, and it's killing our planet. I keep waiting and hoping for leadership and for opportunities for us to organize around a new way of looking at who we are and where we're going. And I can't think of a better group than the group assembled here to start that conversation and to move it along. To think about casinos. We've got to open the casinos. It's critical. Give me a break. We've got to do it different this time. Thanks.
Thank you. And Damien, who do you have next?
There's Nancy.
Yeah, so no, I certainly don't believe that God sent the plague. That's not the kind of God that I believe in. However, it is interesting to look at the parallel between Trump and the Pharaoh, because, okay, so we've had tsunamis, we've had great fires that have burned entire cities. We've had huge floods. We've had the melting of the Arctic. It's like one plague after another. No, that doesn't convince you yet that climate change is really a problem. Well, maybe I will kill the firstborn. And I really started thinking from the very beginning of this thing that the only way we might actually see a political change is with huge numbers of deaths in the red states. I really don't see how people are going to change, but that may be it. It may be that this is the plague that makes the difference. Now think about what the Pharaoh did. Okay, he's convinced by the firstborn dying. Okay, Hebrews, get out of here. And then he changed his mind. But what he should have done was say, how can I reorganize my society without slavery? But he didn't. He wanted to go back to how it was before. And that's exactly what Jody was talking about. We can't go back to it. We have to just let the slaves go and reorganize without them. And I mean, and John also mentioned, I mean, we don't obviously have slaves, but people who are African American or poor or Hispanic or whatever are really bearing the brunt of this thing because they have no way to protect themselves. And our whole society is built on that. It's built on the possibility that the wealthy people can let the poor people do the dangerous stuff and live in the dangerous neighborhoods and live near the power plants and the coal mines and all that stuff. And we really have to realize that we can't do that. And I think public health is the topic where people start to realize finally that we really are all in this together. We may not think so, but we're breathing the same air, we're drinking the same water. We're going to poison everybody if we poison anybody. So I think it's interesting just to look at that story from the Bible and see what you can get from it, even though obviously we don't take it literally.
Yeah, well, we don't take apocalypse literally until we do, I mean, it's, I don't know whose phone it is. I don't know. It's not mine, but yeah, there are meat processing plants in the Midwest that are sites of the spread of the virus, and it's poor white people, it's Latinos, it's African Americans. You look at the shortages of food that you're seeing in the grocery stores today, and it's food that would be harvested by poor people, often Latinos, often people who are illegal immigrants who can't even feel like they're comfortable going to seek medical help because they could be deported. So here we are in this situation that reveals the dependence of our country on the very people that are threatened with being deported. And it is a wake-up call. I don't, I think there's this interesting frustration that many people who are affluent have with sheltering in place, but the other side of it is that the people who aren't sheltering in place, many of them can't afford to shelter in place. And then there are the people who are affluent and indifferent, who are not sheltering in place. They're on the beach in Santa Cruz or at Half Moon Bay or in Fort Lauderdale, not sheltering in place. And then there are the people, the sort of heroic Bible Belt people. The lieutenant governor of Texas who said, well, I'm an old guy. If you have to take somebody, Lord, take me. Well, I mean, I don't know that the Lord has to take anyone. And it's certainly the case that I would rather that I die than somebody else die who's younger, who hasn't had a chance at life. But I don't know that that's a very useful way to look at it, because it assumes that if the lieutenant governor of Texas dies, then there'll be somebody who's 20 years old in Texas who won't die. And that doesn't strike me as plausible. And doesn't strike me as how we should approach this. But on the other hand, we're faced with this triage situation, and triage literally means, what do doctors decide to do under conditions in which there are resources, medical resources, that are limited relative to the demand for them? And that, of course, opens up these enormous ethical questions that reveal the sort of soft underbelly of the American medical system and of healthcare really around the world. So I don't know. So I guess, the question is how do we collectively, Jody raises it, how do we collectively change this? How do we respond to this in a religious way that is committed to our religious vision? And I'd be interested in other people's ideas. I don't want to do all the talking here. Or even
John
most of it.
Bill had a question or a comment?
Is that me?
Yep.
So I had two thoughts. One of them has to do with the beneficial impacts on the planet that we see from reduced human activity. There's been a lot of places where the water is cleaner, the air is cleaner, animals, wild animals are appearing in places that they haven't been before. And if we can do that, we can do it deliberately, and we should. And the other thought is that to some extent we are bringing this pandemic on ourselves. Yet this one and several of the earlier ones that we've been through are diseases that arose by our practices of animal husbandry. They arose from bats, they transferred to an animal that was closer to us, and then we picked it up by the fact that we put those animals together and allowed that virus transmission to take place. So these diseases are a direct result of our own behavior, just like the pollution and climate change are. We need to pay attention to that and think about ways that we can have a little bit less damaging impact on the planet.
Okay. And I think Bob and Bonnie may have a question or comment.
And Jane after that. Yeah, Bob?
Have Jane go ahead first. I think her hand was up before ours.
Okay, Jane.
Okay. Through this, I'm really, I've been brought to really contemplatively looking at what is God for me, who is God. And I come back to God is, for me, a mixture of service to others, with service to all life, and an acknowledgement that God is in beauty, which is nature and all life and what's intertwining. So I've been aware of that, but a big thing that this has brought out for me is how in our society, we older people, a lot of us have it so much better than the youth, the children and the younger people, that kids don't have enough to eat. Younger families are struggling and have no job. So a lot of us who are retired, I mean, it's good that we have, a basis so we're not a burden on others, but it's hard to know how to help when you can't really go out and put your body out there. So it's like, what do we do? So I'm left with, what's important? Well, feeding people and spiritual life and community. So I guess that's come round to me as being important to keep church together while we also try to share as much as we can.
Thanks, Jane. And who was it you said, Bob, and who else,
Bob
Damien?
and Bonnie are together on a call. I think they're one of them.
So just real quickly, I love Nancy's use of the Exodus story. That was quite elegant. And it's a partial answer to Jody's question and a supplement to John's answer to Jody's question, what's going to be the new normal? If we go back in history, Pharaoh had a chance to change the world and chose not to. Thank you, Nancy, for reminding us. The last plague in Europe ended in 1350, and the start of the Renaissance is numbered about 1357 when Plutarch published his Lives. And if we think about just the last century, the last giant pandemic after World War I, World War I was a cataclysm, and I don't have the numbers exactly right, but about 10 million or 12 million people died in World War I. And in the year following, about 3 times that number died from the Spanish flu. And the world certainly looked different after that than it had before. The world looked different after the end of the plague in 1350 than it had before. I think the world is going to look different here. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'd be surprised if it looks like it did before.
Yeah. Sheila, did you have something? I mean, the one thing you mentioned youth, Jane, and that, of course, is a really striking question. A number of us grew up in the heyday of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement and the counterculture. And the thing about those events that was striking is that they affected us in my generation very differently than they affected older people. Older people didn't have to go out and be subjected to the draft and possibly fight in this war that we considered unjust and unethical. And that's going to be in a different way, I think, the case today. Young people seeking their way in the world, they don't even know whether they're going to be able to go to college next fall, whether they'll be in class college. If they're graduating into a world in which the unemployment rate is probably 15 or 20%. The chances of making your career and whatever you thought your career was going to be are radically different. Many people are simply not going to be able to afford the kind of lifestyle that sustained the cruise ship economy, if you will, is what I'm going to call it, and no longer cruising. And so these were the conditions under which a lot of communes and countercultural things got started. So I agree with Bob that traumatic events can be the basis of dramatic social change. The question is what direction those changes take. Matt.
The question.
So, well, a reflection. It seems that, viruses and pandemics and plagues and all are part of the evolutionary process of the earth becoming and changing. And it's often, the danger in them is that they're often exacerbated by human interactions and judgments. The plague, for example, the level of hygiene in Europe was so awful that the rats and the fleas on the rats were around until they started to clean that up. That was a problem. The typhus in the 19th century, until they figured out that water was a problem and that they needed to purify the water and do that. So and it was a problem because there was an overpopulation and a concentration on these resources. So it's always this push and pull of trying to live with that. I think my own view of this particular crisis is not that it's apocalyptic. I think it's going to give us, our culture, a pause for the next year to 18 months. I just heard a report on NPR of the Oxford has come up with, they're working on a virus and they've done some initial tests on it. And India is taking this, actually is going to take the lead in doing some of the human experimentation with this virus. But it seems to be
you
promising.
mean a vaccine, don't you, Matt?
A vaccine, yeah, it's a vaccine. Sorry, I'm talking off the top of my head, so that's always a problem. Yeah, it's a vaccine, and it's possibly going to be available, at least in India, by September, which means, the whole ramp up to a vaccine for the world can be sped up. But this gives us a time for pause, and this religiously is what I'm thinking about here, is it gives us time to sit back and think through the values, because this coronavirus has exposed the fissures in our culture. It's exposed, I mean, we all knew there was a huge division between the rich and the poor. It's really exposed that in the price that the poor pay for this. The concentration of people, the lack of medical resources, anyway, all of the reasons that we can come up with that. And I think that's part of our goal. And we may be at a time in our local church in which, as we're in this interim and interregnum period of time, of really pausing and saying, okay, what are the values of our use of our wealth and our ability to really share with others at this time. So it could be a valuable time coming up, a change of values I see in our, and that's my greatest hope. Of course, my greatest hope is that we get rid of the president and but I don't think it's just fitting one political body in for another political body, because I think it's a values change that has to take place within the culture itself. And maybe, as Nancy said, the deaths are just going to shock us into doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. We are about at the end of the time, and I want to respect that, but I want to give time. We have enough time for last thoughts by anybody who feels inspired. And I want to thank everyone before someone does that, just to say how much I appreciate you all joining in this conversation. And if you're interested and we want to go further with it, maybe we can do it again. But final thoughts from people?
I think Bob and Bonnie have maybe a thought there.
Yeah.
When we're talking about the role of God, one thing that has happened for me personally is instead of coming and going so much, I am forming a deeper connection with where I live. And as crazy as it sounds, listening to the birds and watching the little lizards and just noticing more of nature and the earth. So it's not only feeling in harmony closer to people in our neighborhood, as Matt had mentioned and others have said, with the other humans, but it's also feeling more in harmony with the rest of creation. And I, for one, am hoping that is one value we can hold on to and not feel as if as humans were separated as much as we were before from everything else going on. And I know Bill mentioned that, but you know, that's a very personal thing for me. So thanks for the thoughts. And somebody described God, when we were talking about birds, they said it's God with feathers. So starting to look at the world that way has been of value for me. Thanks, John, for everything you've done.
Thank you, Bonnie. Damien, would you be willing to close us with a prayer?
I certainly can. Can we all be in the mindset of prayer? Oh, divine and great creator beyond our wildest imaginations, we have gathered tonight and we have shared our insights and our ideas and our wisdom, and we have sought out your guidance, and we continue to do so. As we continue to recognize that we are living in a very unusual time, it challenges us to reflect back on history. It challenges us to pause, to take notice, to listen, and to watch. And so we simply would ask that you continue to inspire us to keep on doing what we have been doing in that reflective way, and that you continue to challenge us to think about what our response should be and how we can be the church moving forward from this point in history, and how we can begin to make a larger impact on the world in which we live in. We ask this today as we gather in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you,
you very
John,
much.
so much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you,
Yeah,
John.
thank you all.
Yeah.
This was really helpful to me. I hope it was to everyone else as well. Good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.